Honorable député de Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On November 19th, I noted that the price of Western Canadian heavy oil had fallen to a record low, threatening both employment in the sector as well as provincial government revenues. I noted that this was a major crisis facing our country and that the industry was considering a coordinated production cut in order to reduce prices. I asked the federal government to provide assurances that the Federal Competition Bureau would not intervene to prevent such a production cut. Mr. Speaker, of course, what ended up happening is that on December 2nd, the Alberta Premier announced that the provincial government would mandate a production cut of about 9%. And of course, because this was required by the province and not just coordinated among companies, there was no role for federal competition policy. And I'm pleased to report that this policy that I raised in the House and that the Alberta government implemented was quite successful in rapidly increasing the price of Western Canadian select oil. The Alberta government has also invested in rail cars in order to help move its oil to market in the absence of sufficient pipeline capacity. That also is making a positive contribution to pricing. So these are a couple of very positive examples of what the Notley government has done to steward Alberta's oil industry, and I think all Western Canadians appreciate those efforts. I do, however, want to speak in a bit of a broader sense about federal competition policy. It's already the case that Canadian law does not try to sanction cartels or uncompetitive activity if it's entirely for export, because of course Canadians benefit from being able to get the best possible price for commodities that we're exporting. And I think that that logic largely applies to oil, but of course there is oil that we consume right here in Canada. And particularly, we've had this recent kerfuffle about the application of the federal carbon tax to gasoline. In the past few days, we've had all sorts of photos of Conservative politicians gassing up over the weekend ahead of the federal carbon tax coming into effect. But I think it's worth noting, Mr. Speaker, that carbon tax is about 4 or 5 cents per litre, whereas the price of gasoline has gone up by something like 20 cents per litre over the past month. So at a minimum, this tells us that there are many factors other than carbon pricing that influence the cost of gasoline. But I think, Mr. Speaker, it also suggests that if there is a role for federal competition policy, it should be focused on markets that actually affect Canadian consumers. And I think there is a role for the Federal Competition Bureau to look at collusion around the retail pricing of gasoline. Because, Mr. Speaker, as much as we want to have a high price for the oil that Canada tries to sell on world markets, we also want to make sure that there's a fair price for consumers at the pump here in Canada. And I think the way to do that is to ensure that the Competition Bureau focuses not so much on the oil production, but on gasoline retailing. Thanks very much.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Regina Lewvan for his question. Our government stands with workers in our energy sector and always will. After 10 years of inaction under Stephen Harper, 99% of our oil exports were still sold at a discount to the United States. While the Conservatives spent a decade failing our energy sector by failing to get our oil to new markets, we are working each day to fix their failures. Our government made this issue, and market access in general, an urgent priority. In fact, our government purchased the proposed Trans Mountain Expansion Project and related assets. The Conservatives opposed this investment. On TMX, we are focused on following the guidance from the Federal Court of Appeal to move the process forward on TMX in the right way through meaningful consultations. We also approved the Line 3 replacement project and have always supported Keystone XL. While we work to build new pipeline capacity and gain access to non-U.S. global markets, we continue to take action. In December, the Minister of Natural Resources and Minister of International Trade and Diversification announced a $1.6 billion package to support workers and boost competitiveness. This package includes $1 billion in commercial financial support from Export Development Canada to invest in innovative technologies, address working capital needs, or explore new markets. A new $500 million energy diversification commercial financing envelope over 3 years from the Business Development Bank of Canada. A $50 million investment through Natural Resources Canada's Clean Growth Program in oil and gas projects, projected to generate $890 million in investments. And $100 million through Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada's Strategic Innovation Fund in energy and economic diversification related projects. Mr. Speaker, while the Conservatives continue to put down our energy sector in the last few weeks and months, we have secured the single largest private sector investment in Canadian history with the LNG Canada project, creating 10,000 jobs at peak construction. And there was a final investment decision on a $4.5 billion petrochemical facility in Sturgeon County, which will see 3,000 workers on the ground at peak construction. Inter Pipeline announced 2 new facilities valued at $3.5 billion in the industrial heartland, creating over 2,000 full-time jobs at peak construction. And Nautical announced plans to develop a $2 billion methanol plant just south of Grand Prairie, which will create 1,000 direct construction jobs. These are real investments in our energy sector, in Canadians and Alberta workers. Merci, Mr. President.
Member for Regina, Lewvan.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the Parliamentary Secretary for his remarks, and I'd also like to apologize to the Parliamentary Secretary and to you, Mr. Speaker, for keeping you away from what was undoubtedly a very interesting Liberal caucus meeting this evening. But perhaps I've done you a bit of a favor in that sense. So, you know, if you want to thank me as well, I would accept that. I really have just one question for the Parliamentary Secretary. Given that the retail price of gasoline seems to have increased much more sharply than the price of oil or than the carbon tax over the past month, would he support an inquiry by the Federal Competition Bureau into possible collusion and anti-competitive behavior in the retail pricing of gasoline in this country? Thank you.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to conclude by once again confirming our government's support for this sector, and most importantly, the workers of this sector. While our priority remains on building pipeline capacity and gaining access to new markets, we continue to support the sustainable development of our resources so that Canada can be the energy supplier of choice for the world. That's why we're investing $72 million to fund 3 clean tech projects in Alberta's oil and gas sector, which will leverage more than $415 million in investments. We're investing $49 million to support petrochemical innovation in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. Through Budget 2019, we're also providing $100 million to support the work of the Clean Resource Innovation Network. Our government and all Canadians stand with workers in our energy sector. Mr. President.